Welcome to this inquiry is intended to provide ongoing parliamentary oversight to the government's response to the unfolding pandemic. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I'd like to pay my respects and those of the committee to the elders past, present and emerging of the Eora Nation, and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present or on the web or viewing this material on the webcast. Today we will hear evidence from witnesses from the education portfolio in the morning, including the Minister for Education and Early Childhood, the Honourable Sarah Mitchell, and in the afternoon from representatives from New South Wales Treasury. Before we commence the procedural formalities for the hearing, may I take this opportunity to acknowledge the communities and the government's efforts in controlling the spread of the COVID-19 virus. This does not negate the need for the highest level of transparency and public accountability in our political leaders and decision makers, which brings us to the spirit and indeed the intention of today's hearing. I'd also like to acknowledge the exceptional work by teachers, principals and other school staff in the quick shift to online learning in New South Wales. This was an unprecedented ask in the development of new materials, shifting to new technologies and supporting students in new ways. These same educators are now working hard to allow student re-entry into classrooms and managing both course delivery and health and safety concerns. It's a big task, and we thank them for their important work. I note that as schools return, it is a time of significant anxiety for parents, students and teachers. Public school students are coming back this week and next week on a part-time basis, most for a single day of face-to-face teaching, with full-time classes anticipated to resume in the week of the 25th of May. People are rightly asking questions about how the return is being managed, what supports are in place for teachers and students, and what information are all these decisions based upon. Students want to know what measures will be taken to ensure their ongoing safety. Casual teachers want to know what the future looks like for them, and parents want comprehensive communication about what is planned and why. This is the right time to explore these questions so that we can be sure New South Wales is following best practice measures and any problems are quickly identified and dealt with. I would now like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Like so many other things, we've needed to adapt in the face of COVID-19 health measures. The hearings for this inquiry will be conducted via teleconferencing, via video conferencing. This enables the work of the committee to continue without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. This being new territory for upper house inquiries and there being another virtual public hearing being held by another parliamentary committee simultaneously, I'd like to ask for everyone's patience and forbearance through any technical difficulties we may encounter. If participants lose their internet connection and are disconnected from the virtual hearing, they are asked to rejoin the hearing by using the same link as provided by the committee secretariat. Today's hearing is being broadcast live by the Parliament's website. A transcript of today's hearing will be placed on the committee's website when it becomes available. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. Finally, could everyone please mute their microphones when they're not speaking? All witnesses from departments, statutory bodies or corporations will be sworn prior to giving evidence. Minister, I remind you that you do not need to be sworn as you have already sworn an oath to your office as a Member of Parliament. For all other witnesses, I ask that each in your turn state your full name, position, title and agency, and then take either an oath or an affirmation. The words of both the oath and the affirmation are on the cards on the table in front of you. And we'll commence with you, Mr. Scott.
Matt Scott, Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Education. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Disdar.
Murat Disdar, Deputy Secretary, School Operations and Performance, New South Wales Department of Education. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Disdar. Ms. Harrison.
Georgina Harrison, Deputy Secretary, People and System Performance at the Department of Education. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Ms Harrison. Minister, the opportunity is now yours if you wish to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. I will. Firstly, I'd like to begin just by saying that the government welcomes this inquiry into our management of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we also welcome any findings that the committee may have, and we thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. Over the past few months, the Department of Education has rapidly mobilised to respond to COVID-19. Principals and teachers across the state moved quickly and effectively to transition to a model with students learning from home where possible, while simultaneously keeping schools open for those who are unable to learn remotely. As a result of these efforts in the early stages of the pandemic, we are now well advanced in returning all students back on campus in a managed and safe way. Teams across the department have worked on delivering innovative solutions to the problems presented by COVID-19, including developing remote learning resources, providing professional development for staff, procuring and distributing cleaning and personal hygiene products, and sourcing thousands of devices and internet dongles to support students in need. In addition, we have worked with the early childhood education sector to keep centres open for parents and maintain long-term viability. We have supported TAFE and other training providers to reskill those who have lost work, and we have supported international students. I would like to acknowledge the tremendous and ongoing efforts of all of our principals, teachers and school support staff and department staff, some of whom have been working continuously since the bushfire response, another major operational undertaking for this department. Under the New South Wales Human Influenza Pandemic Plan, the department is primarily responsible for ensuring continuity of education. Key responsibilities included working with New South Wales Health and other government agencies to prevent and slow the spread of the pandemic in New South Wales public schools, supporting the New South Wales community by reinforcing messages from New South Wales Health to staff, students and parents and carers, continuing to provide educational services, preparing for New South Wales public schools to return to normal through an effective recovery phase, providing communication links with the early childhood education sector and supporting communication links with Catholic Schools New South Wales and the Association of Independent Schools New South Wales. The department rapidly convened a task force to coordinate a whole of department response effort in order to meet these responsibilities, and I'm pleased to provide a brief summary of what has been achieved. The department acted quickly to implement infection control procedures. The department has followed the advice of the AHPPC throughout the response of COVID-19. Schools have been implementing a range of strategies to ensure the health, safety and wellbeing of students and staff, including hygiene measures and physical distancing. As a result, demand for essential supplies of hygiene products increased considerably, and some schools experienced shortages. The department stepped in early to reinforce the supply chain by establishing a whole of system response and securing supplies to enable the managed return to school. Health advice is very clear in relation to our students. The AHPPC have said that children do not need to adhere to the same social distancing rules as adults. Schools have remained open throughout the COVID-19 response, and planning for a phased return is underway. Schools have always been open for any child who needs to attend. Attendance rates began to drop dramatically towards the end of term 1 as the number of cases of COVID-19 rapidly increased and isolation measures were introduced in New South Wales. This prompted our advice to families that while no child would ever be turned away from school, parents were encouraged to keep their children at home where possible. By the final day of term 1 on the 9th of April, 94% of students were learning from home. A program of off-campus learning commenced in March 2020, including launching a learning from home hub to provide teaching staff and parents with resources. Professional learning sessions for teachers and support staff were also rolled out. Shortly after, the department developed a model to enable a managed return to on-site learning informed by the latest health advice to ensure continuity of education for students. Statewide implementation of the model has now commenced, with students initially returning to school at least one day a week. By Wednesday of this week, Mr. Chair, an average of 32% of students were inside the school gates. We also have a range of strategies and resources that have been developed to ensure inclusion and equitable access to learning. This includes targeted measures to support students experiencing disadvantage, students with a disability, Aboriginal students and students living away from home. The department reached out to the families of students in New South Wales public schools boarding facilities and Aboriginal hostels to provide parents with options for alternative education provision. There are approximately 3,000 international students enrolled in 265 New South Wales government schools. Schools are conducting a twice-weekly welfare check on these students to ensure their health, safety and wellbeing. The early childhood education and care sector is essential to providing support, care and education, and the department is working closely with service providers and peak bodies to ensure continued access to early childhood education and care services. including out of school hours care, with appropriate hygiene and social distancing measures in place. The department is also continuing to work with the Commonwealth Government to ensure the ongoing financial viability of the sector. Key stakeholder groups have been engaged throughout the COVID-19 response. Both myself as the Minister and the department have been working alongside the New South Wales Teachers Federation, Primary Principals Association and the Secondary Principals Council to ensure the needs of staff in schools are being addressed. We've also been in continuous communication with staff, students and parents, and a dedicated website has been established consolidating this advice. Finally, Mr. Chair, can I say that the department is continuing to respond to the challenges of this unique situation and to deliver beyond our responsibilities under the New South Wales Human Influenza Pandemic Plan. We have always made decisions based on the best interests of our students and staff, using the information available at the time. Throughout the pandemic, we have welcomed and will continue to welcome open discussion with students, staff and the community about our response, and we also welcome the views of this committee as part of the inquiry. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister. We will now move on to questioning by the opposition. Ms. Hsc.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good morning to the Minister and to the Secretary and to the other Deputy Secretaries. I too, at the outset, would like to acknowledge the incredibly dedicated teachers who have worked through this unprecedented crisis to continue to provide children with the best possible education. I'd like to acknowledge the students who face this massive disruption to their learning, and to their parents who have been placed often in an almost impossible situation, being their child's teacher and also trying to juggle their own work and responsibilities. Minister, restrictions in New South Wales are being eased across a number of areas today. The current plan is, as you outlined, for students to attend school 1 day per week. Has that advice changed, and when will it be reviewed?
Thank you, Ms. Hsc. So you're right, we do have a managed return in terms of our plan to get students back in the classroom. That started this week, and we've said to schools we'd like students to attend for at least 1 day per week. That has been the advice that has gone out to our school communities, and it's been going really well. I've been really happy with the attendance data that we've had coming in. I think it's been a good opportunity for all students to get back in the classroom. And we have seen schools take that individual approach. We've given them some flexibility in their timetabling and how they've brought students back on campus. We know, for example, Year 12 students are averaging about 3 or 4 days a week. So there are different ways that schools are meeting that requirement for students to have at least a day a week. And look, we've been quite open about this. The Premier and I have both said publicly that we were wanting this first week or two to go well, and if it does, we'd like to have all students back in the classroom by the end of May. That's still our goal and our hope that we will be able to do that. We're pleased with how this first week has gone, and we'll be having some conversations and discussions over the next couple of days to decide what the next stage is and communicate that out to parents and schools. I would say by the early stages of next week is the timeframe that we're currently working on.
Okay. Minister, according to the ABS across New South Wales, we have over 34,000 households with children with no internet access at home. Yet the New South Wales Government provided just 4,200 devices, computers, modems, internet dongles to students needing assistance. Victoria, in contrast, provided 26,000 internet dongles and loaned 48,000 laptops for their 21,000 similar households. Given most students have been remotely learning for 5 weeks full time and the vast differences in digital access, parental support and capacity, what resources are you giving to schools to allow teachers to assess what students have actually learned during their time at home?
Yep. So I'll get the Secretary to provide a bit more comment in a minute around the actual numbers, because I actually think it's higher than the 4,200 figure that you've mentioned, but I'll get him to clarify that. Look, what we have done is worked with our schools, as you say. We know that connectivity is an issue in a lot of our communities. We've worked with the school communities to procure devices that we have provided. That does include things like laptops and iPads, internet dongles, but we've also made sure that students have the work in whatever format they need. So I know of schools that have sent out physical packs of work for children to do If people don't have connectivity to the internet, we've had USB sticks that have been preloaded with work that has gone out. We've certainly worked very closely with our school communities and our principals to say, what are the needs of your children in terms of that technology? Yes, it is a part of the way that we have been doing learning from home, but there's a range of other resources that we've been providing to schools as well. I might just get the Secretary now to talk through some of those figures just to clarify those numbers, if that's okay, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. And I may need to take some of that on notice. I believe the figure that you're referring to there is an earlier figure, and more dongles and computers have been provided this term, and also more have been ordered by us for distribution as well, if needed. And also what we've been able to do is we've been able to release computers from school and make them available at home on a loan basis. But as the Minister said, this has revealed a level of inequity that exists, not in the provision of computers to schools, but in the provision of computers that are then available, or technology that's available for students at home with broadband access as well. We've done the best we can to provide additional material and support to them, but many schools have also prepared packs of work, units of work that have been available for pick up from school and return to school. In fact, there were schools in rural and remote communities that were doing drop-offs to individual homes as part of this activity as well. But I'll be able to get some precise detail of numbers on notice for you.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I just bring you back, Minister, to the end of my question, which was what resources are being given to schools to assess what has been learnt while they're at home? There are education experts out there, and we all know the value of face-to-face teaching. Education experts have said there needs to be some kind of diagnostic tool that's actually developed, and that teachers will be needing to be given time away from teaching to actually ascertain and make these assessments. What resources are you putting into that?
Thank you. It's a good question, and it's certainly an area that we've been working on and discussing. I mean, obviously the focus at the moment has been how do we support our students who are learning remotely? How do we support our schools to support those students and our managed return back into the classroom? We know that it's much better in terms of a child's education to be in the classroom, and I'm sure members of the committee would all agree, and I think you made that comment as well in your question. So that's been the focus at this point in time, but we know when we're getting our students back full time, we will need to look at what has happened during that learning from home period. Obviously, different students will engage in different ways through that experience. A lot will depend, on personal circumstances, on family circumstances. You did allude earlier to some of the challenges that parents have had in terms of helping to supervise their children from learning from home. And, we're really cognizant of that. So what we need to do is make sure that when our students are back in the classroom, we continue to work with our teachers and principals in terms of what support and resources that they need. There's a range of diagnostic tools that our schools use in terms of assessing students' capabilities and outcomes throughout the school year. We know that we can use some of those with our school communities. And again, I might get the Secretary to comment further because I know he's been focusing on this area as well. But obviously that's going to be priority number one when our students are back in the classroom. What do we need to do to better support students for anything that they may have missed or any delay in learning during this period of time? Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Minister. Yes. What we expect will happen in the balance of this term, that is our teachers will immediately move to assessing student progress, what students have learned over the interruption. To a degree, our schools are very familiar with doing this. The kind of break that we've had from traditional learning now is the kind of break that students normally have over summer. And our good teachers at the beginning of the school year will assess where students are up to and any gaps in learning that might be evident. So there will be assessment schemes that every classroom teacher will use, formative assessment is made. We also have a range of tools that are on offer through the department, including the testing provided by ACER, which is available for our classroom teachers, which also provides some standardised testing and benchmarking measures that can be utilised as well. And we are continuing to talk with organisations like ACER as to whether, in fact, we should roll out further testing offerings as well. So this kind of assessment, this is what our teachers do. There are a range of tools that are already available to them. We're looking at further tools should be made available too. And we know that classroom teachers will be prioritising and making an assessment of learning progress for students that they have made over the 5-6 weeks where we've had interruptions to traditional classroom learning.
Minister, I wanted to come to the question of access to resources for schools, and particularly at the beginning of the remote learning period. You talked specifically about New South Wales being in a better position than other states because we have Aurora College, the online selective high school. Can you tell me how many schools were actually given access to their resources?
The Secretary to respond to that.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. Look, we will take that on notice. One thing I'd say, though, is the experience that we've had through Aurora College absolutely informed all the work that we had been doing around continuity of learning and the learning hub that was created. What we have done, and we can provide details to the committee on it, has created this website that has had enormous traffic for teachers, for parents who are supervising the work of students at home, to allow us to create one unit of work, teaching modules that are used and utilised throughout the department. Some of these were lessons that were created online, other parts were curriculum material, all building on the experience that we've had with distance education for a long period of time, and also using digital technology to be able to deliver lessons and professional development as part of the work that can take place through things like Aurora College. So the capability that we've developed around distance learning through Aurora College absolutely underpinned the expertise that was evident through our continuity of learning exercise and the learning from home support that we provided through that website.
Can I just ask you as well, then was Hsc commissioned with a literature review or with something to actually, was Hsc actually commissioned to undertake a literature review or to inform that practice, or was it just solely
yes.
from Aurora College?
No, absolutely. In fact, one of the things I'd say is as the Minister indicated early on, I think extraordinary work from all across the department, all rallying to support schools, teachers, parents and students learning at this time. So you mentioned Hsc there. I know that Hsc was immediately in touch once this disruption was evident with their counterparts around the world. There was close engagement with the OECD and the OECD work that was undertaking place to do literature reviews around learning during disruption, learning during the pandemic. So we were drawing upon global expertise. We drew from the experience articulated by John Hattie and the work that was done around New Zealand and the disruption to learning that took place in New Zealand after the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. And so, yes, Hsc was very much involved in identifying research on best practice around distance learning and around helping students learn in a disrupted environment as we had here. And so our Hsc people were involved, our curriculum experts, our literacy and numeracy experts, our technology experts. And one of the things that we saw through this activity by the department was a dramatic lift in the level of professional development programs that were on offer and the uptake of professional development on our staff, particularly around the utilisation of the technology to be able to deliver teaching and learning experiences for children who were learning remotely.
I'd appreciate if you could take on notice any specific learnings that Hsc did, any specific papers, and then provide that to the committee. We've obviously got very limited time today, but I do think that the experience of certainly teachers who have spoken to me, and there's been broader discussion about this, has been that they were left juggling themselves, and so I'd be interested for the committee to be informed about that research that was happening.
Well, can I just make a comment on that? I mean, we have, as we know, 60,000 teachers out there operating in 2,200 schools. Can I say that the feedback that we have had overwhelmingly has been gratitude for the creation of that Learning from Home website. The traffic around that has been absolutely enormous. There's been more traffic to the Learning from Home website and the education website than there has been to the New South Wales Health website in the heat of the pandemic because of the quality of information that was being provided, the standing support material for teachers.
Mr. Scott, I might thank you for that. Thank you for that. I think the request was to take it on notice. Are you comfortable doing that?
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Ms. Watt. And again, I'd remind members, if we can, speak one at a time. Ms. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. I believe it's a matter for the witness whether they choose to take the question on notice or not. I'm not sure that within a member's purview to direct a witness to take a question on notice. If they wish to do so and provide more detailed information, that is a matter for them. But I'm not sure that members are really entitled to directing that.
I have the thrust of your point of order. I have the thrust of your point of order. Look, could I just ask all witnesses to be very mindful of the fact we have a very limited amount of time. And I know that there's sometimes, we used to give a very, very long discursive response, and in other circumstances that may be very helpful, but we have very limited amount of time. So if questions could be focused, if there's detailed material to be provided on notice, that would be of assistance. But I think Mr. Scott has the right to finish his answer. So I'll go to Mr. Scott to finish his answer with that observation.
Chair, before you do, can I just make the observation that if a member in putting a question makes an assertion, as the Honourable Courtney Hussos did, then a witness is entitled not only to answer the question, but deal with what was a bald-faced assertion. And that's what Mr. Scott was doing. And he's
Mr. Khan, I accept your point. If members ask a question which is loaded, then witnesses are entitled to address not just the factual matter, but whatever gloss is put upon it. But again, I'd encourage witnesses to be as brief as possible and to the point if they can. Mr. Scott.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a few facts to bring to bear here, and I'll be brief. On the school development days on the 27th and 28th of April, we had 40,000 views on the department's website on supporting teaching and learning sites. We conducted 101 webinars and online Q&A sessions over a 20-day period prior to the Term 1 holidays, 17,000 attendees with a 98.8% satisfaction rating on those. And then on the 3 days before the holidays started, nearly another 8,500 enrolments with a 99.3% of participants indicating that they would use what they had learnt on their course in their teaching and learning practice. I would say, in contrast to the assertion made, that this was truly a remarkable array of professional development that was rolled out in a short period of time to a highly receptive teaching workforce. Of course, this was unprecedented disruption, and we applaud the extraordinary work of our teachers to prepare for this disruption, but we also applaud the work of the department staff who were tirelessly to support teachers in their teaching to the great support of the teaching service.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Minister, we know that boosting testing rates is crucial to economic recovery. This morning, New South Wales Health advised New South Wales has conducted 12,200 tests. That was statewide. Even if all of those tests had occurred in schools, it'd be in the order of 4 tests per school. With testing rates so low across New South Wales, if there was an outbreak in the school, we're really going to struggle to find it until it's too late, until it's spread. What discussions have you had with the Health Minister, with New South Wales Health, about boosting testing? Do you have a target for a rate of testing in schools that would allow us to rapidly detect an outbreak if there was one in a New South Wales school?
Thank you, Mr. Graham, for the question, the Honourable John Graham, for the question. Look, I think I'll make a few comments. I'll also ask the Secretary to respond in terms of conversations with Health. But look, we've been working closely with Health throughout this entire pandemic. Obviously, the Minister for Health is a colleague. We speak frequently as well. For us, it's about making sure that we have that continuity for education. As I said, that's our responsibility under the pandemic plan. We know that the health advice has consistently said that the risk of transmission in schools is very low. We rely on the health advice when we make these decisions. And I think in terms of the broader rates of testing in the community, the public health advice that goes with that, whether it's in a school setting or somewhere else, really they're questions that are probably better directed to the Health Department and the Health Minister. I know that they appeared before this committee last week. We take their advice, but ultimately they're decisions that are made through Health and not through the department. Secretary, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything further to that.
Yes, thank you, Minister. A couple of things. Firstly, I think it needs to be noted, and I'm sure you understand this, Mr. Graham. You talk about low rates of testing. I understand the rates of testing in New South Wales on a per capita basis are amongst the highest, or if not the highest in the world. And so And the clear encouragement from government has been, if anyone has any symptoms at all, get tested. And in fact, when the decision was made to reopen the schools even on 1 day a week, the Premier made it very clear that anyone in our schools who showed any symptoms should go up and get tested. That's not just advice to them, that's advice to everyone in the community. The other thing I want to say is that we have been cooperating closely with Kerry Chant and with the team at New South Wales. We've supported the work of the National Centre for Immunisation Support and Surveillance for the research that they have been doing on any COVID-19 cases that have occurred in a school setting. And you'll have seen their initial research being published some months ago. And that research has not only been tracing the close contacts of those people who have been identified in a school setting, but also testing results of those, including antibody testing or blood testing of those people.
Mr. Scott, I'm aware of those, and that's helpful. We're coming to the close of our questions, so I might just come to that point you just made about symptomatic testing. When will we move to asymptomatic testing in schools? The Prime Minister talked about it 4 weeks ago, more than 4 weeks ago on the 7:30 report. Victoria is doing it, but as you've just observed, the New South Wales health advice is for symptomatic testing. That was issued on April 24. When will we start a program of random testing of asymptomatic people, and when will that be rolled out in schools?
Let me take that question, Mr. Graham, by framing it in a way that I think we're going to be framing a lot of answers today. There are health experts who are experts in pandemics, experts in the epidemiology that underpins a lot of this work. In education, we are working closely with those health experts and we are following their advice and their guidance. So if you are asking us what the testing program should be for the spread of disease in the community, they are questions that more appropriately are directed to the health officials.
Well, they were directed to the health officials, which is why I'm asking you what the health official advice was. We will be prioritising schools in terms of our response when it comes to asymptomatic testing. You're running the education system with the Minister. When will that program start in education?
When we are advised by health to commence it, we have not been advised. The testing regime in New South Wales is determined by New South Wales Health. In all aspects of our response to COVID-19, we have worked in lockstep with New South Wales Health, where they have asked for cooperation from our schools and our education system. We have provided it 100% of the way. If they where they have asked for access for our schools and students for additional testing, we have facilitated that for them, and that is evident in the National Centre for Immunisation.
So just so I'm clear on your answer,
Mr. Graham, the opposition's time has expired. I'm sorry for this round.
Thank you.
We'll come back to that. I'm sure. Minister, your evidence in your opening statement was that if the partial return to school goes well, that we would expect a full return of students by the end of the month. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That's what we've said publicly, and I reiterated that earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. Well, what does it mean if it goes well? Are you talking about that? What's the measure of going well that you're going to rely upon when making that decision about more students coming on for longer times at school?
Look, there's a range of things that we're looking at as part of that. As I said earlier, what we did was, just to go back a step, made it very clear to our schools, parents and students during the school holidays that we would have the first 2 weeks of term to continue to be learning from home where possible, with schools being open for any student who needed to attend. From week 3, which was this week, we wanted to start a managed return to school. As part of that, what we've done is brought in extra measures in our school communities, which I've spoken about before, things like additional cleaning, hygiene supplies being provided to our schools. This was a good chance this week to test those systems. We wanted to make sure things were working well, that there wasn't anything that we may have overlooked in terms of particularly hygiene and safety. So that's the first consideration. The second one, which I think is of equal, if not higher importance, was making sure that our school communities had confidence for children to return to the classroom, particularly our parents and families. Now, we've known all along, and the health advice all along has been that any student can attend and schools are safe. But as I said in my opening statement, we saw dramatic increases in parents choosing to keep their children at home well before the Premier or I said that they could do that where possible. We ended up, the average I think is about 7 to 8% of students not on campus on any given day in a normal period. We got up to almost 40%, and it was rising rapidly each day. And we made the decision, particularly based on that continuity of education for kids, that we should move to that one stream of learning, single unit of work, which is why we did that towards the end of term 1. So for me, it's been looking at the figures of how many students are returning each day. Are we seeing parents are confident to bring their children back to school and enter them in the classroom? Are our teachers comfortable? Are we feeling that the measures we've put in place are appropriate? Is there more that we could have done? As I said, I'm really happy with the first week. I think that it's gone very well, and we'll make a decision early next week about a full return to school.
Minister, as I understand it, you're not going to be looking at or testing the efficacy of the health measures you're putting in place. It's a question about whether parents feel comfortable and a question about whether teachers feel comfortable. But I haven't heard from you whether or not you're going to be testing the efficacy of the cleaning, the efficacy of the social distancing, the efficacy of the health measures you're putting in place to either protect the student population or to protect the teachers. What are you doing to actually test the efficacy of the measures you're putting in place?
Yeah, so, well, look, the health advice is that schools are safe and the rate of transmission is very low. And that has been the case for a period of time throughout this pandemic. And again, I might get the Secretary to talk a little more to that in a minute. But what we are doing is relying on the health advice, putting in these extra measures that have been put in place in terms of on advice from the AHPPC, from people like Dr. Kerry Chant, here in New South Wales. The additional cleaning measures that we know will take what is a very low risk environment and we believe make that risk even lower. Things like staggering drop off and pick up times, making sure we've got the social distancing between adults. They're practical measures. And in some cases, we've gone above and beyond the health advice. Things like providing some of the PPE gear to our sick bays, thermometers for testing. We want to make sure our schools are comfortable to have students back. The health advice is that they are safe places, and we feel confident with that. Mark, I don't know if you would like to add anything more to that.
No, I'd simply add, Minister, that the health advice is to put these procedures in place. And that's what we've done. They said enhanced cleaning. We have enhanced cleaning in place, extra cleaning taking place overnight, intraday cleaning taking place in 2,200 different schools. I want to pay tribute to our team and the team from Public Works, who in a matter of weeks saw the employment of over 1,000 additional staff to be able to provide intraday cleaning in our schools. There are guidelines that we've put in place, supplies that we have sent out, and more than 4,000 supply drops are taking place every week to get our schools up to speed.
Mr. Scott, my question is about what not what the measures are, but what checks you're doing, what measurement you're doing to work out whether or not those measures are working. I don't need a list of the measures. I want to know what you're doing to test whether or not those measures are actually working.
I want to get involved in semantics with you here, but the advice
it's not
is
semantics. It's not semantics.
I don't want to get involved.
It's a different issue.
I don't want to get involved in semantic debates with you. I'm simply pointing out the fact that the health advice is to put these measures in place, and we are putting them in place. So what assurances do we have? Mr. Dizdar is with us on the line. Mr. Dizdar is in contact daily with the Teachers Federation, Secondary and Primary Principals Associations. We have executive directors out there. They are in touch with our directors of education leadership across schools. We are getting daily feedback from our school system as to how this is working in practice. So if there have been any questions about supplies or cleaning provision, they have been forwarded to us and we've been able to attend to those concerns if there have been any, and there have been very, very few. We've been able to attend.
But Mr. Scott, I go again. This isn't about whether or not those measures are in place. This question is whether those measures are working. And as I understand it from the answers from the Minister can correct me if I'm wrong, there is currently no program in place from a health position to test whether or not those measures have stopped or prevented the transmission either amongst teachers which surely would be a discrete area of study, or amongst students? There's none of those measures in place to test in New South Wales at the moment.
Be very careful here. Our responsibility is to follow the advice of the health experts. The health experts have told us. No, I think it's a very
questioning that. I want an answer to my question, though, Mr. Scott.
A very sensitive question, isn't it? Because it goes to the health and well-being of staff and students in our schools, and in ensuring the health and safety of staff and students in our schools, we are following the advice of health experts. They have told us to put additional cleaning in place. We have done that. They have told us to ensure that we have appropriate sanitizer in schools, PPE in schools, and we have done that. Of course, we are closely following any cases of COVID-19 as they occur in a school setting. But on those cases, let's be very clear what we are doing. That on any given day, about 10%, even more than 10% of the New South Wales population will set foot in a New South Wales public school. You will have, on occasion, a teacher, a staff member, a student who will develop COVID-19, of course, who is attending a school. There is no evidence in place that they have got that COVID-19 from school. In fact, the advice we've had from the experts is that the spread of COVID-19 in schools has been absolutely minimal from more than 850 close contacts that they've chased. So what we have done and what we continue to do precisely is follow the advice of the health experts. We defer to the expertise on this matter. And that is...
Mr. Scott, you're pushing against an open door as to whether or not you should rely upon the advice from the health experts.
I'm pleased to hear that.
I'm asking you whether or not those measures have been put in place, and I assume on the advice from health. I understand what the situation is. Yes. I might just move on to another matter briefly.
Sure.
Minister, in terms of the decision to delay the HSC by 5 days, given the enormous disruption that's happened to the Year 12 cohort, where did the 5-day measure come from? And is that really going to be adequate given the amount of disruption that Year 12 students have had?
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'll just make a couple of comments first and ask the Secretary also to respond. I mean, obviously, as you would appreciate, the HSC is run by NESA. The timetable for those examinations is also set by NESA and the NESA board. Mr. Scott is a member of that board, but also what we've done is established a COVID response committee from NESA to deal with some of the issues that have arisen because of COVID-19, particularly as it relates to the HSC. That committee has representatives from the Catholic school sector, the independent school sector, obviously Mr. Scott on behalf of our government schools, Teachers Federation representation as well. So that's been the committee that's been tasked with making decisions about all matters to do with the HSC, and there's been a number that have been made over the last few weeks, and today, as you've noted, the decision or the announcement of the HSC examinations and that 5-day delay. I'll ask Mr. Scott to provide a bit more comment around the rationale behind that decision. What I will say is that we thought it was very important, and we've continuously said throughout this year that students will be able to obtain their HSC this year. It's always been our intention that that would be the case. I think it's important to note that while we are starting 5 days later, students will still get their results in a similar time frame. There's still a similar time frame for the examination period, so that by mid-December, as is usually the case, results will be available for students, and that will help those particularly who might be looking to go to university and ATARs and the like. So look, I think it's been a sensible measure. It's been quite an unusual year in education, to put it mildly, and of course I do feel for our Year 12 students who have had certainly some disruptions to what I'm sure they're expecting their Year 12 to look like. But in terms of the specifics of the decisions around the time frame, I might just get Mr. Scott, because as I said, he sits on that committee. I don't. All right. Have some more insight.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll go to Mr. Scott, and then Mr. Benaziak's round of questioning will start.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Minister. The NESA response has been led by Professor Peter Shergold, who's Chair of the NESA Board, and Paul Martin, who's the CEO of NESA. And a whole series of decisions have been made around the operations of the HSC. We are very pleased we've got to a position now where external examinations will be held basically within the same window as has traditionally been the case. The Minister and the New South Wales Premier rejected some of the ideas that had developed out of Victoria and elsewhere that Year 12 exams would run all the way into December and results not through till 2021. We were always keen to hold to the same timetable. I'm pleased we've been able to do so here in New South Wales. So rather than the exams, this will be announced today by NESA to all schools. Rather than exams starting on a Thursday, they'll start on the following Tuesday, but it will still basically allow the same spread of exams through the HSC exam timetable and the results still delivered in the same week. It just gives a few extra days for students to come back at the beginning of term 4, touch base with their teachers, just a few extra days of preparation without lagging the results and therefore not having an impact on when university offers can take place and when students can securely exercise judgments for 2021. So it seemed like a sensible solution in the circumstances.
Well, we'll probably come back to this. Mr. Banasiak? Mark, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
I am unmuted.
We can hear you now. Don't mess with the button. It's your go.
All right. In 2018, Minister, $75 million was cut out of cleaning contracts, and now the Treasurer has announced that $250 million will be put towards cleaning of government facilities, including schools. Can you give us a sense of how much of that $250 million is being put towards cleaning of schools?
Thank you for the question. I might ask probably the Secretary or potentially Ms Harrison to respond to that. They've been the ones driving the cleaning in schools and the procurement around that. So, Mark or Georgina?
Ms Harrison might come in on that.
So the additional cleaning that we've provided has been in 2 phases. The first phase of enhanced cleaning was to increase the number of cleaning hours at every school site by 25%. And then in preparation for the return of students this week to add to that with additional cleaning throughout the school day in line with those AHPPC guidelines. The specific dollars I'll need to take on notice, but the 25% increase and those intraday cleans have all been done through the Public Works contract in order to give access to that funding that you referenced from the Treasury.
Okay, and what compliance checks are you doing on the enhanced cleaning and the additional cleaning? Because I've received reports from a couple of concerned community members that schools up in the mid-north coast, some schools up in the mid-north coast haven't received that enhanced cleaning. So what compliance checks are you doing? Because cleaning's done at an arm's length using contractors. So I'm just wondering what compliance checks you are doing given the additional cleaning you're offering.
So Mr. Disdar may want to come in here and I'll go to him in a second, but we have a number of ways, obviously, where our principals would be the first to know what the cleaning arrangements are in those schools and would feed back to us through their asset management units if there were any areas of concern. We are also, obviously, through the Dell network, the Director of Educational Leadership, able to check in with schools and see how that is going. We have received feedback that all schools have had that cleaning. So I think as we were rolling that cleaning out in the before this term, at the end of term 1, it was a staged rollout of the enhanced cleaning that's now in every single school, and the cleaning during the day is occurring in every school. Mira, I don't know if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, Ms Harrison has described that really well. Every principal in public schools across the state, Mr Banasiak, know who their asset services officer is, who sit in the asset management unit. If they have any concerns in relation to cleaning at all, they raise that with the asset service officer, who follows up with the cleaning contractor. It's also our operational experience that those cleaning contractors, Mr Banasiak, conduct random inspections of the cleaning for their workforce as well. So the safety layer is the asset service officer to raise any concern, and that normally resolves any issues that arise.
If I could just add too, Chair, with respect, Mr Banasiak, and I say this in all sincerity, if you do have examples, if you've got parents or anyone contacting you about particular schools, please let me know, and that's the same for all committee members. And indeed the public. This isn't about trying to be clever. We want this cleaning in our schools. We want it to be happening, and all accounts that I've had is that it's going very well. But if there are any concerns, please let me and my office know as soon as you become aware of them as members, so that we can double check those arrangements.
And just in terms of cleaning supplies, you've been quite open about sending out cleaning supplies. Have you dictated to the contractors the types of cleaning supplies that are to be used? I know the Premier has been quite open and talking about a 2-in-1 disinfectant and detergent, and that's based on health advice. Have you actually given direction to the cleaning contractors that they are to use that 2-in-1 product that the Premier has mentioned?
I'll ask Ms Harrison to respond.
So our expectation through the Public Works contract throughout government is that our cleaning contractors would be using appropriate products in line with the health advice that we're operating under.
And is the health advice to use that 2-in-1 product, or is the Premier not making that clear?
I don't think it's my position to comment on what the Premier is making clear about health advice. We are following the health advice that we have, and we are expecting our cleaning contractors to follow the advice they receive through Public Works as part of their contract negotiations and provisions.
Okay, one of the cleaners also contacted me and said as part of the enhanced cleaning, all they received was 2 rolls of Chuck's wipes, 2 packs of disposable gloves, and no extra chemicals. Does that sound right? Was that the enhanced cleaning kit that was prescribed by the department?
So just to be clear, the department doesn't prescribe any of the cleaning kits. The cleaning is provided through a contract arrangement through a private firm, and the contract responsibilities on those providers is to ensure that their staff have access to the appropriate materials and cleaning supplies that they need to complete that clean. So if there are particular issues, I think as the Minister has said, around a particular school that we should know about and follow up on, we'd be very happy to take that information and do so.
Okay. The enhanced cleaning talks about cleaning down desks. How does that work in a high school where you've got potentially new kids coming in every hour? Obviously, primary school it's probably a little bit easier for the cleaning crews, but high school I would deem would be quite problematic in terms of maintaining that cleanliness of those classrooms, given the changeover every hour of periods.
So Mr Disdale may want to come in here as well. Our schools have been working with the guidelines from the health authorities to think about how they organise students on their school site through this return to school, to consider how they take the appropriate cleaning throughout the day to maintain the standards that have been set out. Did you want to add?
Yeah, Mr Banasiak, at the moment with our stage return, as the Minister and the Secretary outlined, we're about 1/3 of our students who are attending at any one day inside high schools. So what we're able to do is actually minimise what movement may look like. When we're fully operational, of course, students in a high school would go from one lesson to another and from a practical area to a theoretical area, etc. So there's a lot of movement that can happen. At this stage of the return, high schools, and credit to principals and leadership teams, they've been excellent at timetabling and minimising movement. And where there is movement, they've been with the supply of wipes that have been provided by us as a department, by schools themselves who normally source themselves. We've been encouraging good hygiene amongst our students, and at the end of a lesson, requesting that the student wipe down the desk and leave the lesson and go to the next lesson. That's really good practice. And alongside minimise movement, they're doing all they can to make sure that high-touch surface areas like desks that you allude to are also part of our hygiene routines. And these are good practices to develop in adolescence as well. So for our young people, they've welcomed that opportunity.
So what's the plan for when you increase the level of students at schools? Are we going to up the ante in terms of that cleaning regime at all, or are we, the increased return of schools? Are we doing that on the assumption that everything's fine and we can go back to a normal cleaning regime?
Well, we've followed the health advice the whole way through, Mr Banasiak, and if the health advice remains as it currently is, that we have within day cleaning as well, then we will need to deliver on that obligation. We'll follow the health advice at the time.
If I can just add to, Chair, what we've done in terms of that additional or that enhanced cleaning, my understanding is that will be in place for term 2, for the entirety of term 2. And of course, as Mr. Disdar said, we'll then continue to monitor the health advice. If it's something that needs to be in practice for longer, then that's what we'll accommodate. We will go with the health advice in relation to this matter.
Okay. Minister, there's been quite a few high-profile schools in one of my colleagues' electorate that have been calling out publicly due to a lack of supplies. What's been done in that space? Murrumbidgee High School were asking parents for second-hand soap pump bottles. Collie Amberley Central School was also doing a similar thing. Broken Hill was asking students to bring in their own hand sanitizer. Can you give us an update as to whether those issues have been resolved in terms of getting supplies to those schools?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I know that they were reports that were coming out. My understanding or recollection was that was largely towards the end of term 1. And what we did find, and I certainly referenced this, I think, in my opening statement today and certainly in the House this week, is that when we had, kind of that bonanza of people in the community wanting to access things like toilet paper, sanitizer, soap, I'm sure we all saw it at our local supermarkets, that it became very difficult to procure those supplies. In normal settings, schools are responsible for getting those supplies, often locally sourced, and we found that there were shortages, and we did have schools contact us in relation to that, and Miss Harrison can provide some more insight into that. But that's why we did put together, as I said, that sort of central source of supply and materials to go out. We now have a rolling system. There were boxes and boxes of supplies that went out over the last few weeks in preparation for this week, 550,000 odd items to our school community to make up for that issue that we did have. And we recognise that was a problem that some schools had, particularly, as I said, my understanding is it's towards the end of term 1. That's why we've made some changes to better support our schools to access these supplies. Georgina, did you want to add anything?
Minister and Ms. Harrison, the question was about schools, very specific schools. So if you could answer that question, we have limited time, and if you can't, maybe perhaps provide the answer on notice.
Thank you, Chair. I was just about to ask whether she could clarify whether those schools I've mentioned, do they have the supplies that they were seeking?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, all of our schools were sent out supplies this term. But what I'll do is take those specific schools and tell you what's been distributed to those schools. We'll take that on notice.
All right.
Thank you.
We've run out of time for this round. We go back to the opposition. Mr. Diadam.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your attendance today. Look, it's been a stressful time for teachers. It's been a stressful time for the department. You know, the teachers have gone above and beyond to adapt to a new mode of delivery. I note that the award that covers teacher salaries was made only on the 3rd of March. It provided for salary increases from the beginning of the year, but there's another salary increase that's due at the beginning of next year. I note, Mr. Scott, you got a salary increase quite recently as well. Minister, can you assure teachers that they will get the pay increases that they are due under this industrial instrument?
Thank you for your question. What I will say, obviously, you're making reference to the government's wages policy, and I know that that's been in the media, particularly over the last week or so. I mean, you've got the Treasury officials here this afternoon. These are matters for Treasury in terms of the broader government policy about the wages policy that we have. What I will say in relation to our teachers is that I've certainly had correspondence from the President of the New South Wales Teachers Federation in relation to this issue, which I've relayed to the Treasurer in my role as Education Minister.
Mr. Scott, how much did your pay increase amount to, your recent pay increase?
Chair, sorry, if I may, this is an inquiry to look at the impacts of COVID-19. The Secretary's salary that may, and the determinations around that, which happened last year, is my understanding. I'd question whether these questions are actually relevant to your terms of reference.
Yeah, I know. It's unusual for witness to take a point of order, Minister, but I know you're taking a point of order in that regard, which you're welcome to. I'll give Mr. Diadam. I know, except Ms. Ward, you would have done it if the Minister hadn't. I'll give Mr. Diadam a brief opportunity to make this relevant. I can see ways in which this may be relevant, but I'll ask Mr.
It obviously goes to the message.
So your question's been put. I think Mr. Scott's in a position to answer it. Yeah, I'd ask you very rapidly to draw this line of question.
Well, Chair, I will take the point of order then. And the point of order is this. This committee, and Mr. Diadam may or may not have been at these meetings, but this committee resolved to hold this inquiry in order to inquire into the government's response to the COVID pandemic. It's not budget estimates. It's not an inquiry into wages. It's how we're dealing with this pandemic, this crisis at this time. And we have the education experts here to answer those questions about the mechanics of how we're dealing with this in our schools. Frankly, I think that most people would be interested in hearing answers to those questions on those topics.
Thank you, Ms. Ward. The government does have an opportunity to ask questions at the end if they choose, and this is the opposition's time, and they have the right to allocate their questions as they see fit, provided it's relevant. I can see how this may be tangentially relevant to the issue of COVID-19. So I've made my ruling on it, and I'll give Mr. Scott the opportunity to answer it, and then Mr. Diadam the opportunity to advance this in some way briefly as he sees fit.
Well, I can see, Mr. Diadam, you've been scouring the Remuneration Tribunal report, and I'd simply refer you to the fact that the secretaries have had a 12% bonus that was a contractual statement cut under the last Remuneration Tribunal increase. So my salary package has been cut by 12%. My recurrent pay increase was increased by, I think, 1.5% last year. So that's been the change in my remuneration by the Remuneration Tribunal. And that is a change that was put to me, a change of terms of the contract that I signed when I came on board with the government, but a contractual change that I was willing to accept that 12% cut to my total earning capacity.
You'll accept, Minister, that there is some dissonance between a suggestion that ordinary frontline public servants should be have a wage freeze imposed on them, and the leadership of the department is getting a pay increase. That's problematic, isn't it, Minister?
Well, again, as I said earlier, Mr. Diadam, you're talking about a hypothetical in terms of any decisions about the government wages policy or any change to that. They're matters for the Treasurer, and I suspect conversations with others, including through a cabinet process in due course. But as the Premier has said very clearly this week, there hasn't been any decision made in relation to that matter. You've got Treasury this afternoon. It's probably a good chance to ask them those sort of questions because it falls under their purview.
Can I ask about the NCIRS report? That report was released at a very opportune time in terms of the department's, I suppose, decision making around how the return to school was going to be advanced. Can I ask about the genesis of that report? How did that report come about? The reportage in the media suggests that it was commissioned by the department. Is that correct?
What I'll do, Mr. Diadam, is get the Secretary to respond in relation to those questions, because obviously it was the department working with the Department of Health for that report. So, Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Minister. As soon as we first had cases of COVID-19 that were identified in a school setting, I believe Epping Boys High and Willoughby Girls High, the Department of Health was very interested to commission independent research to track those close contacts of those who had been diagnosed and to monitor them over a 14-day period and beyond. And so we immediately indicated our full level of cooperation with them, and that cooperation extended as we had more cases in and around the school setting. So I can tell you, rather than, I absolutely question the undercurrent in the issue that you're putting forward here. From the first day that we had cases, we were cooperating with the Department of Health to get research and insight into the spread of COVID-19 in a school setting. And so when we had a dozen or more cases, all of those cases had their close contacts checked, ongoing monitoring of those close contacts. And as you'll have seen from the research, more than, I believe, 850 close contacts identified, only 2 new cases of COVID-19 found out of those 850 close contacts, no transmission student from student, no transmission student to adult. And so I dealt with the professor who was in charge of the centre and the research, an eminent expert in immunisation and in epidemics, a highly credible set of professionals who were at work on this. This was important initial research that brought to bear. That work is continuing and it provided good insight. So when they felt that research was ready, then of course we released that research.
So is it your evidence that the initiative came from the Department of Health? It wasn't a case of you, Mr. Scott, or someone else in the department, or the minister or the minister's office approaching the Department of Health and suggesting that it might be useful to have a report of this nature to, I mean, it's appropriate in terms of your process of risk assessment.
It was first raised with me by Dr. Chant. It was raised with me by Dr. Chant within a day or so, as in my recollection, within a day or so of first cases being identified in schools. She indicated that research would be valuable, given the sense that in a school setting you could identify close contacts. As Mr. Disdar said earlier, I think we've had an outstanding process in the schools that we've had to be able to identify close contacts and to be able to track them. It was an important data set for health researchers. Department of Health New South Wales was keen to support it. They asked us if we would support it. We were keen to do so as well. And then the independent researchers went and did their work.
But which agency is paying for the report?
I'm not sure. It's I believe it will be New South Wales Health, or right, part of the research budget of the research centre. I'm not across that.
But just if I could just clarify, the Department of Education has not paid for any of that research, and has not been asked to contribute any funding towards that research.
Right. Thank you for that. I might throw to my colleague. Ms. Hsc, I think, is next.
That's right. Yeah, thanks very much, Mr. Dowdham. I wanted to come to the issue of hygiene supplies for schools. Minister, we asked you a question in the House about it this week. You gave us some figures. We've broken them down. It means that there's 9 rolls of toilet paper per school, 19 bottles of hand sanitizer per school, less than a litre of hand soap, 4.5 bars of soap, 5 rolls of paper towels, and less than 2 bottles of surface spray, and about 7 packets of disinfectant wipes. Now, can you tell me, are schools only sourcing these supplies now through the central warehouse? Are they still able to purchase their own supplies?
A couple of responses. What I will say, with all due respect, Ms. Hsc, is that what I think you've done is very rudimentary mathematics on the back of an envelope and divided the number of supplies by the number of schools. Obviously, we have 2,200 public schools in New South Wales, ranging in size from as little as 10 to 15 students up to 2,000. The supplies that have gone out have been in response to the numbers at the school. We've had different amounts go to different schools, and that's clear and that's common sense, and I'm sure you would know that and would appreciate that. You've also, through the House, asked for, well, actually, no, we didn't. We negotiated that outside, I remember now, a list of all the supplies that have gone to every school in New South Wales, which we've said we're happy to provide to you, I think, within a couple of weeks is the arrangement that we've made. And you'll be able to get a list of everything that's gone to schools, and we're happy to provide that to you. We're very happy to be transparent. In terms of where schools are sourcing their supplies, as I said earlier, under normal practice, they source supplies locally. They're still able to do that if they choose to, if they've got local supplies. But we've got the ones coming from that central warehouse, as I said, to provide top-ups where needed. I might get Ms. Harrison to talk through that a little bit more, but effectively the whole point is to make sure that schools have the supplies that they need. We've got good systems in place. We track amounts that they've got. We're asking schools to continuously communicate with us if they're running low, if there are extra things that they need. Supplies can be shipped out very quickly to our school communities, and I think that, if I can say, the people in the department who handle this area have done a phenomenal job to support our schools. They've been working around the clock, and it's really quite extraordinary. But Ms. Harrison,
Sorry,
did you
before
want to
we go
provide
to
a
Ms.
little bit more?
Harrison, can I just ask you a clarification on that? You said that you now track the amounts within schools, so you can now tell us that there is however many bottles of hand sanitizer in a school, however many toilet rolls in a school. Is that right?
I'll get Ms. Harrison to clarify that.
So we are able to track the supplies we have sent out to schools, and we are now able to track and we're now seeking to track the receipt of those supplies. We are conscious that schools are big places, and that some of the feedback that we know has come around supplies has been from staff who weren't aware that supplies were being held in their offices in the school site. So I think it's important to kind of have an understanding of the school context when we think about where those supplies might be at a given time as they're distributed through the school. We started reaching out to schools
Sorry, Ms. Harrison, you're saying that there are teachers within schools who are complaining about a lack of supplies but might not be aware that they're being held in the office? That's your testimony to this committee?
That's not what she said.
No, so if I could continue with my answer, Ms. Hughes, and if I haven't clarified that, then please come back to me. We have had contact with schools since term one. We have been very open to schools that if they needed supplies, we've contacted every principal and said, if you need supplies, please let us know and we will source and get those supplies to you. As the Minister commented earlier, that started in the context of supplies around the state, of supply chains throughout the country being heavily impacted by consumer purchasing and many bulk orders of supplies going in from across the country, and we responded to that accordingly and sourced supplies for our schools. This term, we have sent out packages of supplies to every single school. Those schools have been received by different staff in the school and distributed where they're needed, but I was indicating that all staff members may not know the full supply stock that a school is holding at a given time, even if they have essential supplies in their learning space. They may not be aware of the stock that is being held in the school as a whole. So I just wanted to clarify that point, because what we tried to make sure every school has at least 2 weeks supply at any one time, and that we will continue to send out supplies throughout the term to make sure that schools are always with those supplies available. Schools should still be sourcing locally for their needs.
Can I
okay, Ms. Harrison, I'm going to stop you there.
The numbers that you've identified, I think, do not reflect the latest information, and it's important to set the record straight on this. Our advice is that as of Monday, 78,000 bottles of hand sanitizers have been distributed to New South Wales schools, 78,000 bottles. So that's on average 35 bottles a school. Some schools are tiny, they only have one classroom. Other schools will receive much more. And this is the supplies on top.
Sorry, Mr. Scott, can I just stop you there? Because the figures that I was quoting were the figures that the Minister provided to the House on Tuesday. Can you then tell me the updated list then for toilet paper, hand soap, bars of soap, paper towels? It sounds as though you needed to update the Minister's House note before she went into the House on Tuesday.
I think Mr. Scott was in the middle of answering that. So I'm going to, rather than, if this addresses your point of order, Mr. Khan, I'll go back to Mr. Scott and give him the opportunity to provide that answer.
I also have a point of order, Chair.
All right. If it hasn't been addressed by me referring the matter back to Mr. Scott, please go ahead.
Well, I think before he answers, and I'll let the last question go through, the honourable member is doing her job and is entitled to hold the government to account. But the House has moved a motion regarding the treatment of witnesses, and that we do so with courtesy. And I think that there's a way to phrase a question to obtain an answer, but to do so in the manner that she has is not helpful and is not in line with the spirit or the letter of the motion moved by the House. Witnesses are entitled to be treated.
Okay, we've got your point, Natalie.
I'm sorry, no, you're not chairing, Courtney. You're not chairing. Witnesses are entitled to be treated with courtesy.
You don't need to run interference. We're being really cooperative this morning.
Ask you to withdraw.
Ms. Hughes, you'll go much quicker. Ms. Ward, I do have the thrust of your point of order. I have the thrust of your point of order.
Seeks to do so. And
I have the thrust of your point of order. And look,
they're running out the clock. They are running out the clock.
Ms. Ward, I'd remind the government members, if you could make your points of order brief, so you won't create frustration by winding down the clock for the opposition. I'd remind all members to treat witnesses with courtesy, And I, again, will direct that question back to Mr. Scott, if you want to update the figures that were given by the Minister, as Ms. Hsc is asking you to do.
If I could answer, Mr. Chair, for a moment, because there was an assertion towards figures that I gave in the House. My understanding is, is that what I said, and I'm happy to check the Hansard, but as at the end of April 2020, that's where those figures came from. Now, obviously, as I said in an earlier answer, we're now at middle of May. We spent the last 2 weeks sending out significant supplies on top of those figures. Very happy to provide the committee on notice with a list of the full amounts that have gone out. And in fact, as I said, I've already got an agreement with Ms. Hsc that we reached this week to send within the next 2 weeks to her a list of all the supplies that have gone to every school. We're happy to be transparent about amounts here, Mr. Chair, but we've already said that publicly.
Okay, given the Minister's answer, I'll move on to another issue. Minister, I wanted to ask you, have you considered installing automatic hand sanitisers at schools? I mean, given we've seen them at the New South Wales Parliament, we've seen them in shopping centres, we've seen them in public hospitals. Have you considered installing those at New South Wales schools?
I might ask Ms. Harrison to respond to that.
So our primary focus has been making sure that schools have the appropriate supplies that they need. To this point, very happy to take on notice providing any information on that we may have back at the department.
Okay, Minister, then I'll come to another question. My time's running out quickly. You've said that social distancing doesn't apply for children in either primary or high schools. From a health perspective, most young people receiving care after 16 years of age are treated as adults. Can you explain then why an 18-year-old studying at university or TAFE is required to socially distance, and yet an 18-year-old studying at school isn't?
What I can say is that again is probably a question that should go to health in terms of why the requirements are as they are for children. What I can say is that certainly in conversations that I've had with Dr. Kerry Chant, and again the Secretary might want to elaborate on this, is that the advice that we've received in terms of the needs not to socially distance in the same way for adults as we do for children on a school site would apply to all of our school-age children. There's no difference in the advice between primary and secondary schools based on what health are telling us. Mark, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, that's true, Minister. We're following the advice of the experts on it. And I'd refer you to the analysis that's been done by Health on incidence of COVID-19 in different age cohorts. What that shows is a dramatic increase in the incidence of COVID-19 for 20 to 29-year-olds. We have had no advice from Health around separate treatment rules, guidelines that should pertain to post-adolescent school students, to pre-adolescent school students. So again, we're deferring to the expertise on this, and I'm sure if they had a different scientific, medical or health view that would be conveyed in their advice to us. There'd be two other factors.
I just want to get one last question in, Mr. Scott, if I can just say, Minister, if there is, as some are predicting, a second wave of this pandemic, what have you learned about the transition to remote learning that you would do differently next time?
Thank you for the question. I think that, obviously, like everybody, we are hoping that there isn't a second wave. We want to make sure that we've got the right measures in place. And as the Premier says at her daily press conferences, we can't be complacent about this. We've all got responsibility to keep that curve flat so that we have a managed response here in New South Wales. Look, I think we've had a really good opportunity over the last period of time to learn about what does work well when we have learning from home. It's certainly my hope and my preference that we are still able to keep children in the classroom throughout this, and that there isn't a second wave that further has any disruption to our education system. Certainly one of the things that I have put in place, and it's a committee that I'm looking forward to their work beginning, is made up of people from both the independent, the Catholic and the government school sector, our teachers, to say, well, what have you learnt through this? What are some of the experiences that we could keep in our normal schooling process when we're back to school? What are the things we've learned that we can improve? So look, I think that ultimately our goal is to have children back in the classroom and to keep them there and move to that phase of living with COVID-19 like we will be in the rest of society.
Minister, can I?
Thank you, Minister. We'll come back to the opposition in the next round. Okay. Mr. Scott, I note you're sitting on the committee that's made the decision to delay the HSC for 5 days. Yes. Is it your expectation, and is it the committee's expectation, that Year 12 students who have had 6 weeks of physical, emotional, educational disruption, perhaps a little longer, are going to be able to make that up with just a 5-day delay to the HSC. How, again, I ask you, what was the consideration about the educational capacity to make good that disruption with just a 5-day delay?
Well, I think it's been an imperfect year for Year 12 students is self-evident, but we had to balance all these matters together. It was the clear view of everyone on that committee, Catholic independent schools, the Teachers Federation, NSW itself, that we did not want to push the exams later if that meant pushing the results later. Part of the thing that we were keen to do for those students who are moving on to university is hold the integrity of their Year 12 work strongly as far as consideration by university for university entrance. Universities, as will be self-evident, will face enormous pressures this financial year in calendar year 2021 with the impact that has happened on international students. And so what you could already see was some universities signalling to students that the Year 12 2020 results won't matter, and they'd go back and check on Year 11 results. And I think there was a concern that if you pushed HSC results further back, then universities would be more likely to try and find other ways of entry ignoring Year 12 HSC. So our feeling was you wanted to hold broadly to the timetable to get the results out in the same period of time and allow those results to be considered by universities and other further education enterprises in considering their offers for 2021. And also, I think there was also a sense of compassion for the Year 12 students as well. Frankly, they've had a difficult year, a challenging year. To push their exams even later, to push their results even later, there seemed to be a fairness question around that as well.
Right. Are there measures in place that are going to ensure that the exams are revisited or the curriculum is revisited or even the expectations under the exams results are revisited, given this enormous disruption that Year 12 students have had? What allowances, what recalibrations will be done?
It's not quite straightforward as to how precisely you do that. Not all students undertake the same unit of work in the same order and the same sequencing. So if in fact you came to a view that we're only going to assess this and not assess that, what do you do with the students who've already studied that body of work compared to those who haven't? So that was quite hard to do.
This is why I'm asking you, Mr. Scott. This is why I'm asking you, because it's so disparate.
I'm saying to you, some of these matters were considered by the committee, but it is not straightforward to how you would retrospectively decide what parts of content were in and what parts of content were out. There were changes that were made around some of the subjects as far as prac work was concerned and as far as special performance elements and the like. So NSW has done what it can. The one thing I would say as well is that many of the students are doing Year 12. They're only months away from another kind of learning environment where they'll be doing more learning from home, more learning online. I think every school has made a commitment to prioritise engagement with Year 12 students, provision of work for them. I know our teachers have worked very hard to get work home, to get work back, to keep assignments and assessments going where possible. So I think it is not the case that it has certainly been disrupted, but it is certainly not the case that our Year 12 students have not been engaged with their study in recent weeks, given that they're 16, 17, 18 years old, quite mature and experienced in their learning, they've been getting on with it. So I think NSW can provide flexibility, but there are limits to the flexibility that's been able to be provided.
Well, Mr. Scott, you'd be aware of the many concerns that have been raised about the disparity in terms of online learning capacity, both at an institutional and an individual level between private schools, which have had significantly greater IT resources, and public schools. Are you intending to make allowances based upon that digital divide that exists between the resources for both private students and private schools on the one hand for online learning and public students and public schools on the other?
I think I'd say to you that Our schools, our government schools, particularly through the Gonski equity funding that we've had, more money has been available for some of our schools, particularly our schools in disadvantaged parts of the state, for their IT provision. I know that all our schools have equipped themselves well at being able to provide provision for students to be able to learn from home. But as we have talked about, some students have not had that equipment that is available at home. But that is the reality that they have been working with through their entire schooling career.
Yeah, but Mr. Scott, that digital divide is now creating far, far deeper educational impacts than before because of the online provision. Will there be allowances to ensure that those students who have been severely impacted by that digital divide, primarily in the public school system, are going to get a fair crack at the HSC?
Well, I believe that, with schools going back, with schools doing an outstanding job at opening up for Year 12 students this week, next week, with hopefully all students back soon, with the exams not starting till October. I know that our schools are going to do an outstanding job to provide every opportunity for Year 12 students. I know we noted the work of John Hattie earlier in this hearing, Hattie's work about the impact of the Christchurch earthquakes on students' results, and it showed that students had actually done well despite that disruption because of the clear focus around studies that emerged when students returned to school. So what I'd say is, as is always the case, if there are special provisions that are required, NSW can look at that on an individual basis. But what I know is that our schools, our teachers are going to be working exceptionally hard to provide every opportunity for government school students in the lead up to this year's HSC.
Minister, I'll put the question to you. I accept Mr. Scott's proposition that public school teachers and public school students will be working exceptionally hard, but they are working in an environment where they have far less access to the online resources. And for some students, a distressingly poor access to online resources. What are you going to do to ensure that there are provisions in place that public school students will not be prejudiced by that digital divide?
Well, look, I think I just echo the comments made by the Secretary, to be honest, Chair. I think that...
we haven't heard anything other than hope that teachers and students will come good. We haven't heard anything about special provisions for the HSC or any special provisions to allow students to apply for dispensation by reason of the digital divide. Will you make that happen?
What I will say to you, Chair, and again, I want to echo, as you said, and the Secretary has as well, in terms of the incredible efforts for our teachers and our schools, particularly that support for Year 12 students, seeing them back in the classroom more frequently this week has been what we've asked them to do. And I know that has been a challenge, but it's incredibly pleasing to see. Certainly in terms of the provision of devices, as I think the Secretary mentioned, we did prioritise our senior students in relation to those devices that were going out. So look, what we need to do now is focus on supporting these students. As the Secretary said, we still have several months until the HSC examinations, and we know that our schools will continue to support our HSC students well, as they always do.
Well, Minister, it's a simple question. Will you ensure that there is a provision, a hardship provision, that public school students can apply under if they have been prejudiced by reason of the digital divide? Will you ensure that's in place so as we don't see the class divide being evident in the HSC results? Will you ensure that's in place?
Well, in terms of any hardship provisions that exist around the HSC, as you know, Mr. Chair, they're not decisions made by a minister. They're decisions that are made by NSW in relation to any variations or provisions that students need to apply for special consideration with the HSC, whether it's health or any other reason. I don't know if the Secretary wants to provide anything further on that.
No, Minister, I want to know whether or not you are going to direct that issue to NSW. I want to know what you're doing as the accountable minister in this regard, and not just bouncing it to NSW. What are you going to do?
Well, with respect, Chair, and I will ask the Secretary to make a comment too, but as what I have done, as I said, NSW Board has put together their subcommittee to look at a range of issues in relation to the COVID-19 response. That has included measures around the HSC, that has representations from us, obviously with Mr. Scott on there, from Catholic schools, independent schools, the Teachers Federation, to come up with appropriate responses based on COVID-19. I trust that committee. There's some exceptional people that sit around that table, and I know that they'll make the appropriate decisions.
I'd simply add, Minister.
Right. Well, I don't think that answer will provide much comfort, Mr. Sorry, Mr. Scott.
No, this is important. The responsibility for running the HSC every year is the responsibility for the Education Standards Authority. No minister interferes in the operation of the HSC. The independence of NESA in running the HSC is an essential part of its integrity. And if in fact you have questions on the operations of the HSC, how students will be assessed, what provisions they get, what marks they get, that is appropriately directed towards NESA rather than the Minister of the Day.
Well, I say again, I think there'll be many students and parents disturbed at the lack of forward thinking in this regard. Mr. Banasiak. Mr. Banasiak's time for questioning. Mark, you've got to take it off mute.
It is off mute.
Working now.
Yeah, must be a delay. The health advice states the cleaning products that are to be used in any sort of cleaning during this time talks about that 2-in-1. Now, going through some of the products that are being used by your contract cleaners, ISS are using a product called Task Force, JOS are using a product called Virex J-Flex 2, Broad Spectrum and Facilities First are using a product called Stride Citrus. None of those, if you look at the material safety data sheets on any of those products, none of them fit or match the New South Wales health guidelines or even the federal health guidelines about being a 2-in-1 cleaning product. So I would strongly urge that you might need to take a closer look at and I guess a bit more micromanagement of these cleaning contractors because they're not adhering to the guidelines.
Thank you, Mr. Banasiak. I don't know whether the Ms. Harrison wants to provide any further clarity. I mean, obviously, as she mentioned earlier, Public Works are doing this work around the contracts for us. In terms of those specific products, I have to confess I'm not overly familiar with the difference between all of them. I'm happy to say that, but what we can do is take the bulk of your question on notice and provide some clarity around those particular products that those cleaning contractors are using, and again, how that tails in with the Public Works contracting and advice as it comes from health.
Thank you. Minister, given your previous critical comments about local schools, local decisions, and tying that in with the fact that you and the Premier openly gave the discretion to schools to decide how a staged return would look, which is effectively a hat tip to local schools, local decisions, and probably arguably one of the greatest local decisions schools would have to make in our time. Has your position changed on the ability of schools to make appropriate local decisions?
Look, I think you're correlating two separate issues there. I mean, I've made comments about local schools, local decisions, as you know, in the House, and said that it's something that we want to have a look at this year, particularly around making sure that all our students all our schools are focusing on those educational outcomes for our students and ways that we can better support our schools and our principals. So that's a separate issue. Our policy intention in relation to that area of policy remains the same, and that hasn't changed. What I will say in relation to the flexibility that we've given our school communities in terms of the staged return is that we've given advice. We've said to schools, we would like you to have students attending for at least one day a week. We would like you to prioritise our Year 12 students. We've asked schools where possible to look at grouping families together. And the reason that we've had to give flexibility, as you would well appreciate, particularly I know given your experience in a classroom yourself, is that every school is different and every school has different physicality in terms of their classroom setup and structure. They know their school communities best. They know the best way to put in a roster that talks about bringing families back in on a certain day. These are very unusual circumstances. This is not something that we've ever encountered before, and I think it was important that principals in this instance were able to supply or apply that localised localised context with the return to school. And by all accounts, the feedback that I've certainly had from our principals organisations is that they did appreciate that flexibility in relation to this particular issue around a managed return.
Okay, this is probably a question for Mr. Scott. What things are going to be put in place for students around their practical HSC projects, whether it be woodwork, metalwork, drama, dance, music, but particularly the projects where, or the subjects where they're having to make a physical product to then be assessed by external markers that may come to the school, or those projects may be shipped to a marking centre. What's being done to support those students who have lost a huge chunk of time to complete those projects?
Yes, thanks for that question. There's a series of advice that's up now on the NSW guidelines and has been communicated to schools around this matter. In April, the NSW committee agreed to cancel the mandatory group performance examinations in drama and the mandatory ensemble performance exams in music extension, reflecting the fact that group performances were unfeasible as under the guidelines at the time. And there have been modifications made to those performance examinations. There's been a 1-week delay to language oral exams. We're now indicated that NES has indicated it's going to use teacher-provided marks, internal marking instead of external marking for HSC technology major projects, and also the body of work in visual arts, but that has allowed for a 2-week extension in submission dates for those students. There have been changes to the mandatory work placement requirements and a range of other changes as well. All of these have been communicated out to government high schools, independent schools and Catholic schools. The material is available on the NESA website for students and for teachers. And what NESA has tried to do is provide as much flexibility as possible, given the constraints that have operated and the earlier timetable for some of these major works. The other thing I'd say is I want to pay tribute to our schools that have, despite the fact that there have been fewer people in and around schools, have done their best to open up schools for students to be able to come in and work on their HSC major works during the recent disruption. But there's full detail up on the NESA website around how this is being dealt with in different subjects.
Okay, and how is the actual HSC marking process going to work this year in terms of adhering to any social distancing rules or going or toing and froing of people to these marking centres? I know a lot of marking is now done online, but there are still quite a few subjects that are done face-to-face in marking centres, and you've got a lot of traffic going in those buildings and a lot of handling of paper and materials. What's going to be put in place in that space?
Well, I suppose the thing I'd say on that is it's a fair question, a fair point to raise. We're in the middle of May. HSC marking around written papers and the like will not be cranking up till end of October. And so in that time, I know NESA, the committee members of NESA and the NESA officers under Mr. Martin will be giving that matter close attention, and we'll be able to provide more advice on that closer to the time of HSC marking.
Okay. And the devices that you and the Minister have spoken about in terms of T4L devices that have been pushed out to schools, what's the plan for those devices once we come out of this COVID-19 crisis and kids are back at school full-time and not needing those devices? Are they going to remain with the school as devices that the schools can use, or are they going to be completely returned to a central hub for the department? What's the plan there?
Yeah, I think that's a policy that we're still developing at the moment. We have basically developed a no regrets option on procurement as many of tablets and laptops as we can. There's been a shortage and very significant demand from them, as you'd understand, given the we're procuring the laptops and tablets that we need. These will be part of the regular supply that we roll out under the T4L provision. And I think, you know, one of the changes that I expect we might look to is we'll probably procure desktop computers for school settings, more laptops and tablets on our mix in the future, because we can see the benefit of technology being able to run because we can see of technology being able to run students who need it at different times. But our precise policy on how we're going to deal with those that will provide recent months, we're still working on.
Just one
and that
final
will become
question for the Minister. In your opening statement, you spoke about your concern for the wellbeing of students at boarding schools. Given that you've said that there's no more money for Yanco Agricultural High School in terms of improving the conditions that the girls' dorm room is in, are you looking to rethink that, given the conditions have been described as Nauru detention centre style conditions? Will you reconsider that and find some money for that school, given that you've just now expressed concern for the well-being of students in boarding schools and their living conditions?
I think the Minister might be having some technology problems, Mr. Chair, so we might take that one on notice.
All right, Minister, can you, no, there's evidence that she's having technology problems from what I can see.
I wasn't sure whether it was my end or her end.
Well, I'll ask again. Minister, can you hear us at your end? Mark, that question broke the system.
That wasn't my intent, Chair.
That's okay. We will just endeavour to re-establish contact with the Minister. We've unmuted her. We've unmuted the Minister at this end. It might be a connectivity problem. Bear with me 1 second. I'll just get some advice from the Secretariat.
I'm downloading.
Thank you. Still, I've lost them here, so.
I think the Minister's pressing reboot, so we'll just allow that to happen.
Chair, in the meantime, I've got some questions on the order of operations and triangular numbers I'd like to put to Mr. Scott from my homeschooling experience.
No, I think we've all had homeschooling experience, Mr. Graham. I'll just see if the Minister can hear us now.
How to say?
I don't think we've quite got the Minister back on.
Well, let's do some algebra.
I've got some very difficult ones here.
Yeah,
I agree. John, my simultaneous.
I might. One at a time. If we'd all be quiet, we'll see if we can hear the Minister. We don't seem to quite have the Minister back online yet. I'll just check if the government's comfortable, whilst we're trying to get the Minister back online, if Mr. Graham and the opposition can direct some questions to Mr. Scott, and we'll continue to endeavour to get the Minister back online. Is the government comfortable with that course of action?
No, I'm not sure.
Mr. Chair, was I coming in? Sorry?
Mr. Latham, you're coming in. Mr. Latham, your round follows that of the opposition.
Okay. I had questions for Mr. Scott, if it suited the opposition for me to go ahead of them.
Right, I think we'd be comfortable with that.
We'll just keep it on hold for the second. We'll give the Minister another opportunity to come on board. We've stopped the clock. But Ms. Warder, I think we might, if we don't have the Minister back on in another minute or so, I might allow Mr. Latham to commence his round of 10 minutes and direct questions to Mr. Scott. And Mr. Scott, I make it very clear, if there's matters you think are better addressed by the Minister, please do let us know in those questions, and they can be taken on notice for that reason.
Chair, can you hear me now?
Mr. Scott.
Yeah.
Minister, it's lovely to hear you. Lovely to
I'm
hear
sorry.
your voice. No, that's okay.
Connectivity is not working in Canada, but I'm back now. I don't know what happened. I can't see all of you, but I can hear some now, so that's better.
Yeah, we can't see you, but maybe you should take that up with your federal colleagues and the NBN. And I
can call on the phone if that's better. I'm happy to ring in on the phone if that's going to give us more consistency for the rest of the hearing, Chair.
We can hear you, but we can't see you. So I think we'll just press on if you're okay with that.
Of course.
And we'll start
Apologies for
the opposition's round. No, it's not your fault. The opposition's round of 20 minutes, then we'll have 10 minutes from Mr. Latham, 5 minutes from myself and Mr. Banasiak, and then we will conclude subject to the government's option to ask questions. Mr. Graham.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you have at least set out a roadmap for the staging of a return to education, and I congratulate you for that. That's better than some of your colleagues in other areas where there just is not a roadmap. But it has been a confusing time for parents and students, and that's especially so for Year 12 students. You wrote an editorial on this subject and you said this: to allow only Year 12 students to return first, as some have suggested, leaves a significant portion of our school students at risk of not seeing their teachers for an entire term or potentially more. Schools then promptly ignored that directive. Newtown High, Kalara, Sydney Girls, Tempe and Greystanes were all reported as ignoring it, alongside many other schools. Do you accept for parents, for Year 12 students, this has been pretty confusing?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I do just want to, I guess, make a few points in relation to the premise of what you've said. We made it very clear that we wanted to have every student to have that opportunity to have some time in the classroom. We thought that that was important. We thought that we needed to make sure that every child had the opportunity to engage, as I said in that op-ed, with their teacher and be in a school setting, because for me, it's very important that every child gets that opportunity. I think that for some of our students, you know, if they don't continue that engagement with their learning, they might not make it to their HSC. So it was never about not acknowledging the importance of Year 12, but it was about acknowledging the importance of every child to connect to their learning and connect to their classroom. What we did say, as I mentioned earlier, is that we provided advice to our secondary schools and said every student must attend for at least 1 day a week, and where possible, we would like Year 12 to attend for additional days. What that's meant in practice is that, as I said, we've seen on average Year 12 students returning 3 to 4 days a week across the state, and that's something that we welcome. I welcome that, and we've been able to do it in a way where Year 12 do get those additional days, but every student gets time in the classroom, and that's exactly what we set out to achieve.
Can I ask about this? Because the Premier then further confused things the following Monday. She said this: we want a staged approach, but obviously for Year 12 we want them, that is schools, to make an exception. That was in the guidelines the Department and the Education Minister had sent out to schools. Principals have said that's not true. They say it's not in the written guidelines distributed to schools. I went and had a look at the guidelines for parents. I downloaded the guidebook. It's not in those guidelines. Did the
we seem to have a break from this connection. If you want to because the second half of your question, John.
I was asking, did the written guidelines to schools contain a reference to all of Year 12 being told to return to school 5 days a week, or did the Premier get this wrong?
What I'll say, again, is just reiterate the earlier comment that I made about the advice that we've given to schools. And I know that both the Secretary and Mr Distar have been speaking to our principals on a regular basis about the expectations around managed return to school. That included, I think, the day that we announced we wanted students to start to return, Q&A session, interactive. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit more through the communications that have gone out to schools and
specifically on the written guidelines? I'm not asking about discussions. Was it in the guidelines?
Well, we said at least a day a week. We've had multiple video hookups with principals across the state. In those, we made it very clear that as they were solving for this, of course, we wanted them to solve, first priority, as the Minister said, a commitment to every student Every student's known, valued and cared for. We wanted to see every student. And I think the feedback from schools this week has been overwhelmingly supportive of that strategy. And I say how glad they've been for every student to be able to walk in the gates this week. It's been too long. But schools...
Mr. Scott, I'll invite you to answer my question about the written guidelines.
Mr. Disco, I'll speak to that in a minute, but I can assure you that in the briefings we did with school principals, we made it clear that we were looking for them to, once they had solved for a day a week, if they could, of course, they looked to prioritise Year 12 students. And the survey that we've done across the state have shown that overwhelmingly they've been able to do that. Mr. Disco might be able to add to that further.
I'll invite him to address the written guidelines if you'd like to, briefly. Right, if not, I might move on to the...
Yeah, hopefully I'm off mute.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Hopefully I'm off mute there. On the first day back this term, term 2, Mr. Graham, we did a live stream with the Secretary and myself and live streamed out to all our schools, and we made it clear that we were looking to support...
I'm not asking about the live stream. I'm asking about the written guidelines that the Premier referred to.
We made it quite clear that we wanted our Year 12 students, where possible, to have enhanced opportunity for on-campus learning. And of 454 schools across the state that have secondary students, high schools and central schools, we're really proud of the fact that they've been able to solve and accommodate in complex timetabling to allow for 3 to 4 days of Year 12 on-campus learning. It's been a phenomenal effort from principals.
Thanks for that, Mr. Distar. Chair, I'm intending to move on. I might ask the Minister this final question. Minister, the other thing you said in that editorial about Year 12s was this: it's a suggestion from those, that is the suggestion to go back to send Year 12 back to school. It's a suggestion from those who've forgotten that we must value the education of every child equally. Given that it had been the view of many teachers and educators, along with the view of the Teachers Federation, can you understand that some teachers felt that criticism was directed at them and that such a statement couldn't be further from the truth?
Thank you for the question. I mean, look, as I said, it was an op-ed where I expressed my opinion, which was that I thought it was important that every child had a day in the classroom, and I think I covered that in my earlier answer. You know, it's something that I've discussed with the Teachers Federation as well. I've been speaking to Angelo Gabrielatos on a regular basis throughout this. I know how hard our teachers have been working, our principals, and we're very, very grateful and extremely appreciative for everything that they've done. We had a clear view as a government that we wanted every child to be back in the classroom, and that was the view that I expressed in that opinion piece.
I might hand to my colleague.
Thanks very much. Minister, NSW has announced that schools don't have to teach the entire curriculum this year. What direction are schools being given about what is essential? What protection is there for a Year 6 student who's starting high school next year that they will cover all of the ground that their colleagues will, or a student who changes schools in the future that they haven't missed out on a crucial part of learning?
I might ask Mr. Disdar to provide some more information, I guess, in an operational sense around the advice to schools. But you're right, what we have done at the request of NSW and certainly with my support as Minister has provided some changes around the delivery of the curriculum. We've made it clear, particularly in those primary school years, for that focus on maths and English as well. And it's just taking into account the fact that, as I said earlier, these are very unusual times. We've got students learning from home. We've got teachers doing an amazing job to make that work. And the idea behind having that flexibility in the curriculum was really in response to what we're seeing with this pandemic. Mr. Disdar, do you want to add something further to that?
Yes.
Mr. Disdar, can you just tell me whether there's been specific guidelines that have been issued?
Yes, we have, Ms. Thusos. On day 1, term 2, we issued guidelines for learning from home and school. In the example you gave for a Year 6 student who'd be in stage 3 in one of our fantastic public schools, we've indicated that there should be 45 to 60 minutes of English learning occurring, 30 to 45 minutes of mathematics learning, 60 to 90 minutes across other KLAs.
Sorry, Mr. Dizdar, I think every parent is familiar with those particular timetables. I wanted to ask you specifically around whether NESA has issued guidelines about what concepts or what focus needs to be. Given that they don't have to teach the whole curriculum, were there specific guidelines that were issued to say not the amount of time that they're spending on each subject? Are there specific guidelines around concepts and subject matter that must be covered this year?
I'll have to take the specifics in relation to NESA on notice, but we gave guidelines to our Ms. Hsc, to our staff, to our leadership teams around minimum requirements across the syllabus, because they teach to the syllabus, as you know, Ms. Hsc, in a at-home and at-school learning environment. We gave them guidance and guidelines around that, but the specifics around the NESA that you're asking, we'd have to take on notice.
Okay, I'd appreciate that. Thanks very much. Minister, I'll come back to you. Minister, I ask this on behalf of many parents. Who made the decision to use Google Classroom as the platform for remote learning? What consultation did you undertake? Did you have a tender process, and what was the criteria for that tender process?
I'll ask the Secretary to provide some comments about that. I mean, obviously, my understanding is, and I'm happy for him to clarify this, but is that Google Classrooms is one platform that is being used in schools. I know from personal experience from my daughter's school, they're actually using Microsoft Teams. So I'll ask the Secretary to elaborate further in relation to that.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. Yes, a full suite of options being used by schools. Microsoft Office, Microsoft Teams, Google G Suite, Adobe Connect. We've used Zoom as well. A range of offers, and this we've had procurement exercises with these IT providers over a period of time. Often, what schools have used have been the IT system and infrastructure that they have been using up until the time of the Great Disruption, and they have built on the top of that. You know, one of the things we will do...
Mr. Scott, can I just... sorry, our time is really running out. Can I just ask you, would you be able to provide for the committee on notice any information about which numbers of schools are using the particular different platforms?
Okay.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Minister, I wanted to come back to you. Some families have decided not to send their children back to school for 1 day a week, and that might be because they are vulnerable or because someone in their household is. How long will remote support be provided to them, or when are you looking at phasing out remote learning as an option? Are you just going to transition these people to general distance learning?
Thank you for the question. It is a good one. Obviously, what we've seen this week are the overwhelming majority of kids returning to the classroom on the day that they've been allocated to attend, which has been good. I will say what we've done, particularly you referenced students who might have, personal health concerns, and as is always the case, those individual students and principals can have discussions about what is needed for those students in terms of their health. The expectation certainly is when we return to full classroom teaching again, and we hope that that is happening by the end of this month, as I've already indicated earlier in the hearing, that students will be attending as per normal practice. Attendance will be marked, and it's being marked at the moment on the allocated days that students are supposed to attend. There will, of course, be medical provisions, as there is, frankly, in a normal case in our school setting, and the Secretary might want to elaborate further on that. But once we return to face-to-face schooling, it is our intention to go back to normal as best as we can in terms of the delivery of education. Mark?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Minister. In a way, if there are medical reasons why a student should not attend school, then our schools do an outstanding job at providing learning materials from home for them wherever possible. So that's what we would transition back to. When schools are open for everyone, schools will be open for everyone. And I think it's very fair for our teachers to say to them that we expect their focus to be on the delivery of classroom learning for the students who are attending at school. So we'll manage this appropriately. We expect overwhelmingly our students will return as when the doors are fully open, as we've seen great engagement around the 1 day a week learning this week, and that we expect will continue through next week, and then decisions will be made. But when schools are open, we expect schools will operate as close to normally as possible. But if there are students who have medical reasons why they can't be there, then of course we'll look to support their learning in an appropriate way.
Okay, so taking from that, then, Minister, you're saying if schools return at the end of May, as you and the Premier have outlined is the plan, then that is when the remote learning will end, and they will need to be transitioned to some kind of general distance learning if a decision's made. That seems right.
Yeah, look, I mean that's broadly the understanding that I have in terms of how we're going to make this work. Because, as I said, once we're back at school, the idea would be to be back at school in the most normal fashion as possible.
Okay, I've just got one final question, then I'll hand to my colleague, Mr. Diadam. I'm mindful of your earlier comments about the working party that's in place of teachers about what can be learnt from this. I'm interested to know if there is anything specifically already that you have learnt from this time of remote learning that's going to stay for the future. Is there a single innovation that you can point to now to say this is going to stay in place for the future?
Well, as I said, that's why we put that committee together to provide that advice, because I respect that teachers in the classroom will understand far better in terms of what's worked for their students. And again, these are things we can measure when the students start to return to school as well. I don't know whether the Secretary wants to provide any additional commentary for that one.
Yeah, I think, there are things that we're particularly going to look carefully at. One, I think, is the tremendous speed and quality of professional development that we've been able to roll out. I think one of the challenges for us is how the learnings from the COVID-19 disruption help us address underlying issues of concern that we had prior to the disruption. One is about how you provide good quality professional development for teachers in rural and remote areas, how you allow those best-in-class teachers that we've identified to be able to disseminate their best practice at speed throughout the system. I think we've been able to do that using the tools and the professional development focus that we've had in recent weeks. We'll look to keep that going. I think there has been...
Mr. Scott, I'm really sorry. We're running out of time. I've got one last question, which is, in terms of the transition back to school, Minister, are you looking at going straight to full time, or will it then be to 2 days or to 3 days? What's the plan for parents?
Yeah, so that's, as I said earlier, the considerations that we will make over the next couple of days. We wanted to see how the managed return to school process worked this week. We already said to schools that's likely to be in place for 2 weeks, which would be this week and next week. But we'll be in a position early next week to provide that advice to parents and schools as to what the next stage looks like.
Okay, sorry, my colleague, Mr. Diadam.
Thank you. I might just square the circle on my earlier line of inquiry. I'll start with Mr. Scott. In terms of the NCIRS report, were you or any member of the department staff consulted about the timing of the release of that report?
No, I was just knew that it was coming and that it was available, and then it was going to be released. But that was, I was just aware that the report was being finalised and it was coming, but that finally was a matter, I think, in the hands of New South Wales.
Minister, I'll put the same question to you. Were you or any member of your staff aware of the timing of the release of that report, or consulted?
Yeah, look, as I say, obviously we were aware, as the Secretary was, that the work was underway. My recollection is, and I'm happy to check, I know that some of our stakeholders were briefed in relation to the report a couple of days before it was released. I think I was briefed the following day, which I think from memory is a Friday, but I'll take that on notice. And I think the report was released on the Sunday. So it all happened within a matter of days.
Yes, I can add to that, Minister. We were aware that the headline findings had been generated, the report was being finalised. So we did pull together a briefing for Teachers Federation, Primary and Secondary Principals Association, Catholic sector and independent sector. I believe that was on the Thursday evening, and the report was released on the following Sunday.
Mr. Diadam, I'm sorry, this allocation of time has expired. And we're going to go to Mr. Latham now, who has 15 minutes of questioning. Mr. Latham.
Thank you, Chair. I'd start by thanking the Minister, her staff, Mr. Scott, all the departmental officials and the frontline teachers and support staff that have done a good job in this extraordinary and difficult circumstance. Could I start with Mr. Scott and just say I share some of the Chair's concerns about what's happening with the Hsc, not just regarding the digital divide, but, you know, all Hsc students are disadvantaged, some more than others, and digital access is a big part of that, but also whether or not they've had a parent at home helping with their homeschooling, and also whether or not they've had their own self-starting motivation to feel suited to homeschooling. So are other measures other than the 5-day postponement of HSC startup being considered to try and overcome the overall issue, but also to particularly help the students who've fallen even further behind? And here I refer to shortening the holidays at the end of term 2, whether teachers would be available in a more intense way to help during the STUVAC that normally precedes the HSC exam period, and also whether private tuition could be made available, paying students who've fallen a long way behind to do private tuition over the weekend to make sure that in the difficult circumstance this is as fair and successful a HSC period as possible.
Yeah, it's a good question, Mr. Latham. Thank you for that. Look, I think a range of options will be considered as we pursue, helping these students get to the line at the end of October for the HSC this year. One thing I would say about holidays, I think our expectation is, as was the case in the last holidays, we know that many of our teachers will continue to be engaged with students during the breaks. Now, there's been a bit of discussion around face-to-face time. I point out that it's only a 2-week break for government school students in the middle of the year. But even in that holiday period, I think there will be opportunities for students to engage, and I know that many of our teachers will be doing that. And of course, part of the extension, I think, part of those extra 5 days is to actually be able to push into term 4 more opportunities for student engagement as well. There have been some other suggestions that we are pursuing and identifying. I'm not in a position to be able to identify them now, but they are more along the lines of some issues that you have spoken about how you make available for students support if they have questions in addition to what's available in the regular classroom setting. We'll be looking at that at the department, and I know Nessa will be looking at that as well in coming weeks.
How much of this will be mandatory? Because you say you know that many teachers will be helping over the school holidays. What are you doing to ensure that they're helping, which of course is the key question in terms of that service delivery?
Well, I think we can trust our principals with this, Mr. Latham. I mean, there will be a clear sense in schools, and I know from principals I've spoken to, they have told me about how supportive their schools are of their Year 12 students throughout the year, and I think we can have a strong expectation that we will see that through the year. And so we'll look forward to feedback from schools. If there are concerns from schools around this, they will let us know. But our expectation is that all efforts will be made to ensure strong support for our students through to the HSC. I'm not sure if Mr. Disdale wants to add to that.
It's Mr. Latham, as the Secretary indicated, the Year 12 teachers in particular across the state, remarkable job in not letting drop what the continuity of learning looks like, even when we're 5% attendance inside the school gates. I know of many instances across our sites where they were delivering synchronous lessons through the technology, as in either Zoom or Google Classrooms. They were running the timetable in that school almost like it was face-to-face. That's not quite like being inside the school gates. At the moment, that looks like 3 to 4 days. Hopefully we can transition to 5 days. And as you'd appreciate, a lot of the courses also are completed prior to the end of term 3. So a lot of the syllabus requirements and outcomes are completed, and a Year 12 teacher then use a period of time for revision. So how our schools will recalibrate that timeline, a lot of schools run homework centres, a lot of schools run after tutorial sessions themselves, they'll be best placed to work out how to meet their needs of their cohort. But I take your point about what systemic things might we do to support our Year 12 teachers and our Year 12 students, and they're for further consideration, like the Secretary indicated.
Yeah, well, I know the department always puts a rosy spin on things. I think the reality out here in the suburbs, quite frankly, is that for hundreds of thousands of students, this has been an extended holiday, and Mr. Scott indicated as much earlier on. So if you can do more than an hour of homeschooling, you're going great as a parent, your kids are going great. Look, I think you'll find the problems worse than what we're talking about. So the more mandatory catch-up, urgent emergency measures the department puts in place beyond trusting in principles is going to be highly advisable. But on that question of K to 12, Mr. Scott, you mentioned ASA tests earlier on. At what point do you think the department centrally will have a handle on how far the students have fallen behind once all those tests have been put in place across the system?
Good question. Can I just, one point of clarification. I don't think in any of my testimony today I've indicated that I believe that, hundreds of thousands of students have been on an extended holiday. I think...
no, you compared it to the summer holiday. I'm quoting you from earlier on. You compared it to a period like the summer holiday, and it's not your fault.
No, I was simply... What I was saying there, Mr. Latham, I think it's a very important point that needs clarification, is I was indicating that our teachers are experienced in making assessments of students when they have returning after a prolonged break from being present in the classroom.
Okay, so, and what did that show?
6-week break from presence in the classroom, they're used to that. And so I think by in the second half of this term, what we will be expecting teachers to be doing is using formative assessment tools to be able to identify learning progress from students. We'll be using the learning progressions that have been rolled out by the department, which provide quite granular insights, particularly around literacy and numeracy, for what students can be have been doing. Then we will also be looking to be able to get data from students when, in fact, they have been undertaking the PAT tests that are developed by ACER. So I would hope by the end of term 2, we'll really have quite a good sense of the impact that the disruption has had on the learning progress of students. And we'll be reflecting that back to parents in the term 1 assessments that are provided to them in the year.
Thank you. And what's the intensive catch-up plan once you've got that data at hand?
Well, I think we need to see what the data says. But one of the things I think we have been able to do, and it goes to the answer to the question to Ms. Hsc earlier on, is that one of the things you'll be aware of in the Masters review, the initial Masters discussion paper on the curriculum, is in a sense of decluttering the curriculum and really making sure there's a clear focus on the fundamentals in the curriculum on literacy and numeracy. I think our clear expectation will be, particularly in primary schools, that the focus will be on literacy and numeracy mastery. We know these are the foundations for learning. We know this is where the early assessment will take place. When formative assessment takes place in classrooms, that's what teachers will be focusing on. And one of the things we will be saying to teachers is that some of those other curriculum areas will not be as important as allocating the time to ensuring mastery of literacy and numeracy. And that's where the focus will be. And that's where the NSW guidelines have been useful to schools to indicate that they are in a position to focus on literacy and numeracy mastery as we return to schools.
Thank you. Is there any general indication yet as to how much money schools have saved by not having students in attendance?
Yeah, not as much as you may have thought, quite frankly. Different costs. So what we saw many schools do was go out and upgrade their own technology, purchase of laptops and tablets in order to distribute to students as well. A significant investment in and around professional development. In a sense, what we did as part of a staffing support was guarantee the employment of casuals, make a forced payment in a sense from schools to employ casuals. So the all the normal costs in operating schools, your staffing costs, your casual costs, your technology costs, those costs continued. Cleaning has continued. In fact, cleaning is now costing us significantly more than it was at the beginning of term 1. And
so what would the estimate for the level of cost saving overall?
Say that again. Sorry.
What's your best estimate as a percentage on the level of cost
I
saving?
think we're going to have spent money in different areas. You know, we're going to have turned off the lights in some classrooms, but basically, what are our big cost drivers? Staff. Our staffing remains the same. There's some flexibility around casuals. We've guaranteed the casual expenditure. We've increased the technology expenditure. We've increased the cleaning expenditure. We're not expecting there to be savings in the operations of schools at all through this disruption.
And if I could just turn to the Minister, please. Minister, do you think you jumped too early in cancelling NAPLAN for this year?
Look, what I think in relation to NAPLAN is obviously that was a decision that was made by all education ministers. We did so at a period of time when, we were having significant cases a day, and I think across the feeling across all of the states and even from the federal minister in addition as well, because it was a consensus view of education ministers that NAPLAN not take place this year. And in fact, it would have been NAPLAN week this week. So the concern particularly then was around having an accurate data source. We didn't know how many children would be in the classroom during this week. Certainly the health predictions around the curve and the way that it was going, we didn't know what kind of social isolation measures would be in place in communities. And we also had concerns particularly around the marking of the assessments, how that would work. We made the call and we made it early because a lot of schools, as you would know, Mr. Latham, do preparatory work for being in the online environment. That was starting to happen and in fact was due to happen just after we made that decision. So it is a cancellation for this year. We know that there's other data sources that we can get from schools in terms of assessment results. And there was agreement, as I said, and consensus from every single education minister around every state and territory and the federal minister as well, that it was the right decision not to have NAPLAN this year.
But Minister, would you say that given what's called the Great Disruption and the inevitable weakening of student basic skills, that basic skills testing is more important than ever before to identify the students and schools that have fallen further behind? And schools are safe, and you now have greater certainty about the reopening of schools. Why can't NAPLAN be held in August, September, October, November or December?
Well, look, as you'll appreciate, that's not a decision for me alone. Obviously, that's one that is done. Anything around NAPLAN comes from the federal government and also every state and territory. Education ministers, as I said, were comfortable with the decision that we made on the time based on, as I said, the available evidence and what we could see was happening in terms of the exponential numbers of cases. We made that call early. No one has raised the issue of doing NAPLAN later in the year at this point in time. If education ministers decide to discuss that when we meet again, then that will be considered. But as I said, my view is that there was a strong agreement from every minister around that virtual table when we made that decision that it was the right call for this year. And as I said, it's not on the agenda at this point in time for it to be held later in the year. I mean, we've got to think about consistency of data sets as well, and there's a range of issues around that, as I know you'd appreciate. I think that, the general view would more likely be that, it's a year of data that we've lost, and of course that's not ideal, but we can have NAPLAN return next year. And as you know, I hope that it returns in a format that is a little different to what we've got now, just so that we can have the most accurate data sources that we can use in terms of student outcomes and progressions.
Well, now that the evidence has changed, the facts are known, schools are safe, will New South Wales lead the national argument to have NAPLAN in either August, September, October, November or December?
Well, look, as I said, I'm comfortable with the decision that we made. I think it was the right call. If it is something that is discussed at Education Council, we'll consider our position then.
Okay. Can I just come back to the departmental officials and ask what training has there been inside schools for sick bay staff in the identification, prevention and control of this particular virus?
Let me briefly speak to that, and Ms Harrison might come to as well. We have provided extensive gear to our sick bays, PPE, temperatures and the like, temperature checks and the like, all within keeping of the health guidelines and how we need to be making these schools. I'm not sure if Ms Harrison wants to add to that.
Yeah, just to add to that, the health guidelines has been that our existing infection control procedures that are present in our schools now are appropriate for managing in cases in our schools at this time. So that guidance has been reissued to schools and they've been reminded of that. The additional provision has been sent out to schools and we'll continue to monitor whether our schools are finding that satisfactory or not.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Mr. Latham. Minister, you've said on a number of occasions during this inquiry words to the effect of teachers are doing an amazing job. And there, I think, sentiments that are reflected by all on the committee. But can teachers be assured that there's going to be more than just those words from you? Can they be assured that you're going to go into bat for them to ensure that they don't have a pay freeze, given the amazing job and the extraordinary work they've been doing? Are you going to be on their side in that argument?
Look, Chair, I think I covered this issue when Mr Diadam asked me earlier in relation to the government wages policy. I indicated to him that I'd had representations from the Teachers Federation about that, which I've conveyed to the Treasurer. And frankly, any discussions that may or may not happen with colleagues in a cabinet setting or around government wages policy, I'll put my views forward at Cabinet. That's the appropriate forum in which to do that, and it's not something that I can or would discuss with this committee, as I'm sure you would appreciate.
Yeah, Minister, I'm not asking you for what you say to your Cabinet, but I'm asking you now, what are you going to say to teachers? Are you going to tell them publicly you think they should get their pay rise and that you agree with the Federation?
Again, Chair, I think I've covered this already. There is no the wages policy at the moment, as the Premier has said, there is no change at this point in time. There are considerations happening, obviously, by government, which the Treasurer has alluded to. You've got the Treasury officials here this afternoon. I'm really not going to comment on that in a hypothetical sense. As I said, I'm speaking to the Teachers Federation representatives about a range of issues. This is something that they've raised with me. They've formally written to me recently as well. And I will respond to the teachers, including the representatives from the Federation, about this matter, as I have been doing and will continue to do.
Minister, when it comes to early childhood, have you kept track of the number of early childhood centres that have closed over the last 3 months? And in answering that, perhaps you could tell us whether or not you're satisfied that there's capacity in the early childhood sector to ensure that as the economy hopefully starts kicking back in, places will be available for parents?
Thank you, Dave. It's a good question, and it's good to be able to talk about early childhood in this hearing as well. I'll be able to get some specific data from you in relation to any services that may have closed over the 3-month period. The Deputy Secretary responsible for early childhood isn't on this teleconference, but I will seek that advice from him and give that to the committee. What I will say is that it's very important that we have our early childhood services operating in New South Wales, as you say, to support parents who are returning to the workforce. We made commitments around certainly the community preschools, which we fund, continuing their Start Strong funding, and also providing extra funding to cover the fee gap for parents, and that's been worked out on an as-needed basis with those services. We've had that really has given them that financial viability to stay open, which we know has been welcomed by the sector. And we also stepped in to provide some extra support to our local council, local government-run services who weren't eligible for some of the federal packages as well. So we've made some significant investments in early childhood, particularly, as I said, the community preschools that we run and the long daycare and council-run early childhood services as well, because we know it's important and that's why we were happy to make those financial commitments.
Minister, most of the support packages that are available, the big ones like JobSeeker and JobKeeper, are going to be there at least until September, October. I personally think that they should be much longer, but that's a different debate. But the packages that have been put forward for the early childcare centre, particularly the federal one, I think expire on the 28th of June. What are you going to do to ensure that the childcare sector can survive post that 28th June?
So obviously for our services, our preschool funding, which I alluded to, we've made that commitment for terms 2 and 3. So that is, over this 6-month period. For our support for our council-run long daycare and early childhood services, we've set up to 6 months. And obviously that complements the federal package. You're right, they have put their timing due towards the end of the financial year. That's something that we will continue to work with them on. I've always been very strong and vocal in my views on early childhood education with the Federal Minister, and I'll continue to do that on behalf of our services to make sure that they're supported.
And that includes representations to extend the federal scheme beyond the 28th of June. I believe it should be extended. Is that your position, Minister?
Well, look, as I said, I think we need to let the current package go its course. We've still got a few periods of, we're now in mid-May, so they made that decision based on the end of June. Our local government support, which is the only one that, as I said, complements the federal package, we've made that available for up to 6 months. And of course, we'll work closely with the federal government in terms of what support is needed. And it will be something that I will no doubt be discussing with Minister T in the appropriate timeframe.
All right. Minister, Mr. Scott, Mr. Disdar and Ms. Harrison, I'm sure you're disappointed to know that the time has now expired for this hearing. But could I, on behalf of all the committee, thank you for your time, but with one reservation. The government has an opportunity now, if they wish, for a round of questioning. Ms. Ward, Mr. Khan, Mr. Mason-Cox.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted the opportunity to echo other members had the opportunity to say this, and I just wanted to commend the great work that has been done. This is a crisis, it is a pandemic, and I just wanted to say to Mr. Scott, Ms. Harrison, Mr. Disdar, and to the Minister and all of the frontline teachers out there and their support staff that it's been an incredibly difficult time, and your leadership and consistency through this is appreciated. As a mum at home, I am struggling with my simultaneous equations, and any guidance I can get on that I'd be very grateful for, but just wanted the chance to say thank you and know that there are very many parents who now are very, very appreciative of what teachers do and have a greater level of understanding of how much we need them. So thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Ward. I've recently discovered how much I've forgotten about calculus myself. Mr. Khan or Mr. Mason-Cox, did you have any further contribution?
I'm entirely chilled.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to take that as an indication that that concludes the government's questioning. And again, could I thank all of the witnesses and particularly the Minister. I know there's been a little bit of a technical glitch there with you, Minister, in terms of the video feed, but I thank you for your forbearance. Thanks to the committee members for the manner we went about the task today. That concludes this aspect of the hearing. We will have a further hearing on Treasury commencing this afternoon at 2 p.m. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.